In this lecture, we are going to finish the login form by submitting the values to our custom endpoint. The process is very similar to the registration form. For this reason, I think this is a great opportunity for an exercise. Try tackling the solution. Pause the video and good luck. Welcome back. Hopefully, you were able to submit the form without my help. If not, that's fine. Let's tackle the solution together. The first step is to listen for the form submission. At the bottom of the function, let's run the signinform.addEventListener function. The name of the event is called submit. Next, pass in an arrow function with the async keyword. In a moment, we're going to be running an asynchronous function. Ahead of time, we are adding the async keyword. The next step is to disable the default behavior by accepting the event object as an argument. Inside the function, run the event.preventDefault function. So far, so good. We've got a function for capturing the form submission. Our next move is to update the form. Users shouldn't be able to modify their input while the form is in submission. In addition, we should inform them of the submission. First, we need to select the elements for performing these actions. Create a variable called signInFieldSet. The value for the variable will be the .querySelector function. We're going to select the fieldSet element. Similar to the registration form, the login form has the fieldSet element wrapped around the inputs. Next, create a variable called signInStatus. The element containing the status has an ID called signInStatus. Next, let's update the elements. For starters, we can disable the form by calling the setAttribute function on the signInFieldSet variable. The name of the attribute is called disabled. Its value will be true. This attribute will disable the form. Next, we can update the signInStatus.innerHTML property to add a message. The message will be wrapped with a div tag. It'll contain the following classes: modal status, info. The message will contain the following text: please wait, we are logging you in. Now that we've prepped the interface, the request can be sent to the server. However, we don't have the URL. Let's inject the variable into our script by updating the enqueue.php file. In an earlier lecture, we called an array called authURLs. This variable gets injected into the document as a JavaScript variable. Most of the work has been performed. We can update the array to include another URL for the login endpoint. Inside this array, add a key called signin. The value for this key will be the following code: escape URL raw rest URL up/v1/signin. After adding the URL, we can head back to the script. Let's create a variable for the form data. Below the updates to the form elements, create a variable called formData. The value for this variable will be an object with two properties called userLogin and password. The name of the properties is very important. Our endpoint is expecting properties with these names. Otherwise, our request may be rejected. The value for the user login property will be the following: signinform.querySelector #si email.value. In the form, I have given each input an ID. The value for the password property will be the same, except the ID is called si password. Lastly, we can start sending this data to the endpoint. After the variable, call the fetch function. The first argument is the URL. Let's pass the upAuthRest.signin variable. Next, pass in an object for configuring the request. The endpoint only accepts POST requests. let's set the method property to post. Afterward, we must change the file type of the request by adding the headers object. The file type can be modified by setting the content type header to application/JSON. Lastly, we can add the body property for sending data with our request. The value will be the json.stringify function with the form data variable. The fetch function returns a promise. By sending the request as is, the browser will not wait for the request to be completed before running the next line of code. We can wait for the request by adding the await keyword. The value resolved by the promise will be returned after adding this keyword. Let's store the response in a variable called response. The response object returned by the fetch function will contain various pieces of information. However, we're not interested in most of the information. The body of the response contains the data we'll need to process the response. Let's extract the body by creating a variable called response.json. The value for this variable will be the response.json function with the await keyword. Adding the await keyword is a must. Without this keyword, the variable will store a promise. The JSON function will grab and format the response's body into an object. The final step in our process is to check the status of the response. If the form was submitted successfully, we will refresh the page. Otherwise, the form must be re-enabled. Below the variables, create a conditional statement with the following condition. Response json.status == 2. A successful authentication will have the status property set to 2. If this is the case, we're going to update the signInForm.status property to a div tag with the following classes: modal status, success. The message will say the following: Success! You are now logged in. Lastly, let's reload the page with the location.reload function. The authentication may fail. If that's the case, let's add an else statement for handling failures. Firstly, the form should be re-enabled. This gives the user the opportunity to modify their info. On the field set element, the disabled attribute was applied to the element. Let's remove this attribute by calling the signInFieldSet.removeAttribute function with the disabled attribute. Next, we can update the signInFieldSet.innerHTML property to update the message. Add a div tag with the following classes: modal status, danger. The message will say the following: invalid credentials. Please try again later. We're finished. That was a lot to go through, but nothing you shouldn't be unfamiliar with. Overall, we're sending a request to our endpoint. Afterward, we're handling the response by checking the status. Let's try testing this form. In your browser, refresh the experimental page. Next, let's open the modal to view the login form. I'm going to submit the form with invalid credentials. As expected, the authentication will fail. Next, I'm going to submit the form with valid credentials. Great, we've successfully logged in. At the top right corner of the page, the username or email should appear. This indicates we're logged into the system. Pat yourself on the back. We've completed the forms. There are some finishing touches that will apply to our solution before considering it complete. Once you're ready, I'll see you in the next lecture.